What's up YouTube, I'm FirestarW and I'm here with a review of the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI. After a long search, I wound up purchasing this particular capture card for myself as I felt it had what I needed. So let me introduce me and what I want out of a capture card. I'm a gamer that runs Ubuntu Linux and I want to live stream my game consoles of several different eras all on one card. What does this card need? One major thing is having the video connectors for all the game consoles I'll use. Composite, S-Video, Component, HDMI, and maybe VGA, although on screen here I have a note on why just maybe. Additionally, I want my ideal capture card to support all the various video resolutions and format that my game consoles can use. This is a big thing to look out for, as there are video resolutions that certain capture cards cannot capture. The best example of this is a resolution used by game consoles from the Nintendo Entertainment System up to the PlayStation 1, the 240p resolution being output over the component video connector. This is not a common thing, and many capture cards and even a large number of televisions do not support this. The main use of this combination is PS1 games on the PS2. It's not just that I'm a big PS1 head. 240p over component support also unlocks the potential ability for me to use SCART to component adapters for several of my older gaming consoles, and lets me use these cool HD Retrovision cables that basically do this conversion for me. Next in my wishlist for a capture card is simply more speed than USB 2. Since I want to be able to capture HD resolutions and I'd rather not deal with a huge amount of capture latency, higher bandwidth connections are preferable. Finally, I want to make sure I get a capture card that will actually work when I connect it to my computer, i.e. it needs to have Linux drivers and support available. So overall, I'm looking for an upgrade with all the connectors I want, support for the resolutions I want, more speed than USB 2, and support for my preferred operating system. And yeah, I did say upgrade. I actually did own a capture card previous to getting the titular one, a cheap USB 2 EasyCap. However, it's composite only. It has an S-Video input, but it doesn't actually work. One of the quirks of this card, since there are a bunch of variants of it. Throughout my capture card search, I always had this card in the back of my mind for comparison. So eventually, after a long time searching, at the bottom of the first page of Google search results, I found the Magewell brand of capture cards. Magewell is a capture card company based in Nanjing, China that boasts support for all three major platforms, and all of their current cards are part of their second generation, so I guess they've kinda been around. The card of theirs that stuck out to me was the Pro Capture HDMI, a card that seemed to fit the bill for what I needed for about $299 USD. I went to look for reviews, and they do have USB 3 HDMI capture cards that are well regarded, but these are the only things that seem to have any sort of eyes on them. When it came to looking for reviews on the Pro Capture HDMI, there were nothing but these weird and useless YouTube videos back when I searched. This made me a little hesitant about getting this card, and is part of the reason I made this review. I looked into getting the card anyways and found you could purchase it from either Amazon or B&H Video, at least in North America. After finding it on Amazon, I decided to get the card due to the fact I could return the card under Amazon's policies. So after about 4 minutes into this video, let's actually get into the review. First I'll go over the specs, the unbox and installation, basic usage of this card on your computer, how the card's capture performs, and finally my recommendation and comparisons to other cards. The Magewell Pro Capture HDMI is a PCI Express version 2.0 single-lane internal card. The operating systems it supports are Windows 7 and above, Mac OS X 10.8 and above, and Linux with a distro about equivalent to Ubuntu 12.04 and above. It is compatible with the x86 and ARM CPU architectures. The card is powered by the Analog Devices ADV7842, Magewell's own custom Z-Links FPGA, and DDR3L RAM. The card has an HDMI 1.4a input directly, and via a DVI-I breakout, you can get component, S-Video, and composite video jacks. For the HDMI input, it supports up to 2K res 60 FPS. It allows use of custom ED IDs, supports the 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit color depths, has support for RGB and YCB CR color sampling, supports up to 8-channel audio streams, and has support for extraction of various data in the video. For component video, the card supports the RGB and YCB CR color formats, supports sync on green, sync on luminance, and has support for customized video timings and resolutions. For the composite and S-video connectors, the card supports the NTSC, PAL, and CCAM standards. Without the PCI bracket, the card is 92.76mm long, 68.88mm wide. The card has a mounting hole for mounting. The card comes with a full-length and a half-length PCI bracket. The card features a physical rotary on board to support multiple cards in one computer. You turn the dial to change its identifying number or letter. And the card features status LEDs that you will probably never see in actual use, unless you like having the rear end of your PC facing you. To handle incoming video, the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI features 2 video processing pipelines with about 180 megapixels of processing bandwidth each. This gives the card support for multiple video output streams, provides built-in scaling, cropping, and deinterlacing, and allows the card to do aspect ratio, frame rate, and color format conversion. Finally, additional features of the card include on-screen display, hardware timestamps, low latency mode, SG-DMA transmission mode, and upgradable firmware. So I did actually order this card earlier this year in February to be exact, and when it arrived, it came in a small generic white Magewell box. On the box itself, there's a sticker that says to go to mobilevideodevices.com to receive the drivers. Upon unboxing, you'll find the card itself, the breakout cable, the half-size bracket, and a small card saying to go to streamdynamics.com for support information. So, 2 sites for one device and no driver, CD, or SD card or anything included with it for those without internet. This isn't the only oddity you'll find upon unboxing. When you look at the breakout cable, you'll notice that the composite video end is a weird connector you may not recognize. It's a BNC connector used in broadcast, I guess. You can kinda see it in this small picture on Magewell's website, but it's not specifically mentioned anywhere. To use this composite video connector, I purchased a BNC male to RCA female adapter. The classic ability to confuse audio and component inputs is present on this breakout as well, sadly. They could have added a little band or something to differentiate the audio red from the component video red, but they didn't. You'll probably want to put a little piece of tape or something on one of them in order for you to distinguish the two. Physical installation of the card is fairly simple. Simply push the card into an open PCI slot and screw in the back bracket, perhaps after removing the cover bracket and unplugging your computer and all that first. You'll then want to plug in the breakout cable for any non-HDMI video input, and make sure you screw it in real good. This breakout falls out very easily otherwise. While we're on the topic of plugging things into the card, I want to remind everyone that this card does not have built-in splitting, so if, for example, you plug in your Wii, it will only feed video into the card and not also a TV, unless you get an external splitter, like these ones that I own, for each type of input. Moving on to the software side of things, installation could be a bit wonky if you decide to follow the instructions on the box. If you go to the exact URL to mobile video devices on the box, you're greeted with a page not found. It's maybe due to the age of the box or something though. The mobile video devices site is the North and South American distributors website, and it is a bit messy in my opinion, but you can find the product page for your card. There you can find a download button on that page. However, it's all kinda useless as it's all the same information as Magewell's website, and the download link just takes you to Magewell's site anyways. The support information of Stream Dynamics given with the card is about the same way in my experience. I tried calling the number on the card and got no response, and going to their website gives you nothing useful. Meanwhile, Magewell's site has an online support form that I have filled out and gotten responses from multiple times, so I'd just recommend skipping the sites given on the box and just use Magewell's site if you get a Magewell card. On the Magewell's download page, you'll find a wide variety of things, including drivers, manuals, firmware, capture software for Windows, and an SDK for Windows and Linux. Installation of the driver in Linux is fairly straightforward. If we take the supplied installed script and run it, it will build the driver in what I assume is a kernel module without DKMS, which means that anytime you do a kernel upgrade, the driver will not automatically get reinstalled, which means you will need to remember to rerun the installer every time you do a kernel upgrade, unlike, for example, the NVIDIA graphics card driver. Additionally, the installer also installs two default programs for the card, the command line programs mwcap-info and mwcap-control. These programs allow you to see input information, select the video input connector, and all that type of stuff. For now, text only is the only way to interact with Magewell capture cards with official software in Linux. In Windows, there is a GUI program to interact with the card, and I did ask support if it would come to Linux. They responded that it would come in Q3 2017, although by the time I got this review out, I think it's past Q3 2017 and it's not out yet, but I guess it's on the table at least. I was initially thrown off by the fact that these programs were command line only, but no need to fear. Simply type the name of one of these programs without any arguments and it will print a big list of every command and every option you need with these programs. So that's good. When you use the card with programs like OBS and the like, there are some settings exposed in these apps as well, so the card isn't 100% command line only. On the Windows side of things, you also get a simple installer, and this one doesn't come with any default software, however there is the Capture Media Express software available by Magewell. This not only controls the card like the Linux apps, but it can also do recording. Now after I installed the drivers for my card, I wanted to upgrade the firmware, and initially what I did is I used the Windows program to upgrade the firmware, as it didn't seem like there was any firmware upgrade utility on Linux. When I contacted support about some other issues though, they told me to use some programs that came with the Linux SDK, and it actually turns out there's a bunch of useful programs stowed away in the Linux SDK. Not sure why they don't come with a normal installation, but if you are using the Linux version, I recommend installing the SDK for the programs it comes with. One of these programs is a firmware upgrade utility, so even if you don't own a copy of Windows, you can still upgrade the firmware on your card. Moving on, I'll cover basic software usage, first under Linux. The card's video appears as a V4L2 device, and so you can open it up in any program that you would use, say, with a webcam. InPlayer, Cheese, OBS, etc., with VLC being the only exception I found. Audio input appears as its own audio device, which can be selected by any audio program, such as InPlayer, OBS, or Audacity. Going into more depth on the included software, first with the mwcap-info utility, this one is here to, well, give info. There's really only one option you need to give this program, which is the print all info one. You then can see the card's firmware information, current temperature, as well as data on the input video and audio, so that you can verify that, say, a 720p video over HDMI is being read as 720p. The other utility, the mwcap-control program, is what actually allows you to interact with the card. As mentioned before, you can select the input video and audio sources, set all the video processing features, and also modify the EDID, set custom video timings, control the back LED, and turn on low latency mode. I'll show an example of a command I frequently use, one to set the video deinterlacing mode to weave. The command is basically the program name, the option, and then the video device that corresponds to the capture card. Here's a quick look at using this card in OBS. You'll need the V4L2 device source and the audio input source to get both the video and the audio of the card. For the video source, OBS shows the options for video resolution, frame rate, color format, and video input connection. You can use it like any other source in OBS and say apply the 4:3 aspect ratio correction in OBS instead of in mwcap-control. Let's also take a quick look at the Windows side of things. The card works fine in OBS, Magewell's Capture Media Express, and the famed AMREC TV, which seems to be the preference for retro gamers in Windows. So let's finally get into the meat of the review, how the capture card actually performs and captures. For this, I used a wide variety of game consoles, primarily the Nintendo Wii U and Wii, the Sony PlayStation 2, and the original Xbox. For recording the footage in this video, I used OBS Studio with the X264 encoder, recording at 1080p 60fps for most footage, with a few exceptions. Some footage is pulled from my live stream recordings, which are 720p res at 48fps. For each input of the capture card, I tested every resolution and video mode I could get out of my consoles, checking the quality and the latency of the capture for each input. Additionally, for the analog inputs, I used the 240p test suite homebrew on the Wii and the Dreamcast for additional analysis. To start off the testing process, I first tested the HDMI input. Here I used the Wii U, which covered basically everything I needed to test except for 2K res video. In addition to different resolutions, I also tested differing frame rates with HDMI. So let's finally take a look at some video from the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI. First, we'll look at the Wii U menu, which is in 1080p res. The video is crisp and clear, the audio is clearly there, and it looks basically like what you would expect to come out of the console. Moving the cursor around, we can see there's no gargantuan delay or any choppiness, and basically everything seems good. CPU usage is around 23% in OBS Studio. Now we'll look at one of the few 1080p 60fps titles on the system, Smash 4, and as the card specifications say, it does indeed capture 60fps. If you have your video's quality set to 60fps on YouTube, you may be able to tell this simply from watching this footage being shown. The easiest way for me to verify this was to use Magewell's video preview utility in their Linux SDK and set the preview to 30fps and then compare it to the preview at 60fps. The difference is like night and day, and it's definitely needed for watching fast-paced games such as Smash in a recording or live stream. Moving down the chain, 1080p 30fps content would be the next to try, but there are only a handful of games that run at that, none of which I own, so instead I'd next tested 720p res games running at 60fps. Captain Toad, Nintendo Land, and Super Mario 3D World are all games I've played through while recording with this card. Additionally, 720p 30fps games such as Pikmin 3 and ZombiU have also been recorded fine on this card. Given that there are games like The Legend of Zelda, The Breath of the Wild, that have more varying frame rates and capture fine, I assume that as long as the frame rate of the video is under 60, the Pro Capture HDMI will capture at that frame rate. Not with the full games, but with the settings of the Wii U, I also checked if 480p video as well as 1080i video could be captured, and indeed, they do get captured by the card. As you can see here, when changing resolutions with HDMI, the card will flash a Signal Not Found screen. An additional piece of HDMI, HDCP, was something I could not see how the card interacts with, since I don't have a Netflix or Hulu subscription, but I'm 99% sure that the card will just show Signal Not Found or something, since that's the whole point of HDCP. Next, I decided to try to see how much capture delay this card has. To do this, I did tests where I put the input from the Wii U on my monitor to the left, and the preview from the capture card on the monitor to my right. First, I did this in a setup where I used the timer in Smash 4. While you might be able to glean a bit of info from this video, it is less useful than it could be since I set my webcam to do a low variable frame rate recording. I also did a YouTube video designed for timing in this setup, but this footage was also recorded with a low frame rate from my even crappier Galaxy S3. Nevertheless, snapshots from this footage easily show time differences between the card and the original. Here, from a Smash 4 snapshot, we can see that there are approximately 50 milliseconds between the original picture on the left and the capture on the right, as 1/100th of a second, which is what the rightmost digit is 10 milliseconds. For reference, one frame in this game, 1/60th of a second, is 16.67 milliseconds. Photos from the YouTube video show similar results, with there being half of a 10th second difference between the two, where a 10th of a second is 100 milliseconds. However, it turns out the delay from the preview apps vary. I compared latency between just apps capturing and found inconsistencies of about 50 milliseconds. What particularly app is launched or when it is launched doesn't seem to have any particular effect on this variance. This means that you will need to add or subtract some margin of error to my findings. Additionally, this capture card has a low latency mode that you can turn on. I ran the test with Smash 4 like before, this time also getting 30 FPS footage. The snapshots I nabbed look similar to the previous ones, but it seems the deviation is a lower number rather than a higher number, leading to readings of about 30 to 50 milliseconds latency with low latency mode on, a modest lowering. Personally, I haven't used low latency mode much because I'm silly and thinks there's issues that are probably placeable. If you want to use it to help use your monitor as your TV, it honestly seems fine. There are also apps included in the SDK that will detect capture latency, mwcap low latency, as well as mwcap low latency GUI. mwcap low latency simply shows latency. I'm not sure if it's with low latency mode on or not, while the GUI version shows the latency amount both normally and with low latency mode on. The normal HDMI capture latency is about 17 to 20 milliseconds according to mwcap low latency GUI, and low latency mode delay is about the same. However, it also lists a total latency which may factor in the application delay I showed before that varies, and may explain the conflict in with what I found before, as the total delay number matches more closely with the 50 milliseconds values I found before. Additionally, I checked the HDMI audio capture using the settings of the Wii U, setting the output to mono, stereo, and 5.1 surround. They all seem to work. However, I don't actually have a surround sound system to play back any recordings from the capture card. If you look at the mwcap info program, it does list the data in the audio channels, and also shows 2 more if you perhaps input it with 7.1 surround. While we're on the topic of audio, I'll go ahead and talk about the RCA audio jacks since they're basically their own separate thing. Let's listen to a few quick samples.
Here we go.
Sound is captured fine without any distortion or skipping, which was an issue with my old EasyCap. Stereo sound is captured fine, however mono audio is not auto-detected and recorded as such. Generally for other devices such as a VCR or a TV, plugging in only the white jack for mono will still let sound play in both speakers or channels. I'm not sure if it's a limitation of the card or not, but from the recordings in OBS I've listened to, as well as loopback I've listened to, it still comes in as stereo, playing audio in only the left channel. For older consoles such as the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Sega Master System that only have a single mono audio jack in their AV cords, you'll either have to use a Y cable in your cord setup somewhere, or simply downmix the audio to mono in OBS or something similar. It's not too hard of a thing to work around, but it is puzzling that such a fully featured card doesn't have such a basic thing. There isn't a setting to set the audio to mono or stereo in mwcap-control, so I'm not sure if Magewell are even aware this is an issue to look out for. This card doesn't do any Dolby Digital decoding as well, so any Dolby Digital surround sound will not be read as surround. While we're on the topic of auto detection, I want to bring up another thing: input auto detection. I haven't talked about the input auto detection much, since it works mostly fine, but there is one case where auto detection doesn't get everything, and you'll need to manually set the inputs. This is when using HDMI video with audio in the RCA jacks, and perhaps vice versa as well. Moving back to video, HDMI capture was shown to perform well, so let's move on to component video. Here I use the Wii, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Instead of starting at the highest possible res and moving down like I did with HDMI, I'll start with the most common. First from the Wii, we can see Super Smash Bros. Melee, which is a game that runs at 480p. The picture is pretty crisp and clear, which is expected for a component. Next, on the PS2, we see Pac-Man World 2 that runs at 480i, the same resolution as Melee, but interlaced. Now, I didn't really talk about interacting with interlaced video with this capture card, or interlaced video in general much yet, but I'll explain now. Whenever the Pro Capture HDMI detects the video input as being interlaced, it automatically applies its built-in blend deinterlacing, so you don't have to look at this weird look of just interlaced footage. The quality of this blend deinterlacing is kinda blend isn't a good fit for every game, however. There are other deinterlacing methods available for one to use in programs such as OBS Studio. I've made a separate companion video meant for those that own this card, and in that I walk through how to use other deinterlacing methods in OBS Studio. However, it's not too necessary to know these specifics when just making a purchasing decision on this card, just know it's possible. Moving on back to the component video testing, I next tried the higher resolutions that the Xbox could do, 720p and 1080i. Tony Hawk's Underground 2 can be played in 720p on this system, and as seen here, it is much nicer looking than its console contemporaries. It almost looks like a PC game. While there weren't too many 1080i games for Xbox, I do have one of the few games that does, MX vs ATV Unleashed. As you can see in this footage, it really almost looks like a PC game, although the interlacing/deinterlacing does make motion look a bit worse than a usual PC game. Finally, using the PlayStation 2, I tested the thing I expected to most likely not to work on this card, and that is the lower 240p resolution PlayStation 1 games. However, upon booting up my copy of Hello Kitty Cube Frenzy, we see that this card actually does capture 240p video over component, verified by mwcap-info. So not only does this card have a nice HDMI input, but it has a nice component input, being able to capture a video resolution that only one other line of capture cards I know does. Honestly, I'm very happy that this card does this. After testing the component input with just games, I then tested it with the 240p test suite on the Wii. Here I was able to test whether 240p video was being properly displayed and processed, find capture delay, and use PAL resolutions as I live in NTSC land. I did full tests with each input, which I've uploaded as a separate playlist that you can go and watch. For component, the main thing to take is that the Pro Capture HDMI does indeed capture proper 240p video. It passes the drop shadow test, where sprite is to flicker at 60 FPS if it is proper 240p video. Otherwise, it may flicker slowly as shown here when the capture is not at 60 FPS, or only shows as solid or invisible if not properly displayed. I also attempted to measure capture latency with this test, but I did not have another monitor to test with like HDMI with a component input in, so the only option I had was a manual reaction time test, which isn't too useful or consistent. From this, I got an average of 60 milliseconds. The mwcap low latency program showed about the same delay as HDMI, however, 20 milliseconds, so probably about 50 milliseconds including the app like HDMI. When I tested the PAL resolutions, 288p and 576i, they all worked with this card. Finally, I did a changing video modes test, where the video changes from 480i to 240p and vice versa. Some PS1 games and PS2 games do this, so it is important for this to not have any issues. Thankfully, this card handles it properly with no weird flash or flickers in between, so no worries for these games. Let's move on to the S-video and composite inputs of this card. There are only two resolutions for me to test on these two video connectors, 480i and 240p. First, I recorded footage from my Nintendo 64 for S-video footage. Unlike my old EasyCap where it is converted into garbled composite video, the S-Video on this card is actually S-Video, providing that slightly clearer picture compared to composite. For composite, I use my Nintendo Entertainment System and plug-and plays. The composite video, while being the lowest quality video connector on this capture card, does have some sense of quality to it. It does appear to be clearer than my old EasyCap, which is a bit muddier, as you can see in this comparison here. However, unlike the component input, which does read 240p input, the standard definition inputs can only read interlaced video, meaning all input I've shown it is read in as 480i, even if the source is actually 240p. This is a shame, but not unexpected at all, since as far as I know, no 240p composite or S-Video capture card actually exists, and from what I know, over composite and S-Video, 480i and 240p video signals are very hard to tell apart, so I can imagine it's not an easy task creating such a card. However, this does mean that all input, including every 240p game, will have to be deinterlaced, which isn't the most optimal. I also use the 240p test suite on these two inputs, on the Wii for composite and on the Dreamcast for S-Video respectively. The results for both of these inputs are the same, so I only show one set. It didn't particularly matter if I set the video to 240p or 480i in the program, since both are read as 480i anyways. When it is read as 480i and unmodified, it does fail the drop shadow test and looks worse overall. However, if you use the AudiF2 interlacing in OBS Studio, the drop shadows test is now passable. If you use any other deinterlacing method, it will fail. Deinterlacing to recover 240p video is basically what you have to do with every capture card. The video at least doesn't have any additional jitter or other issues that some capture cards do have with 240p video read as 480i, so that's good at least. The PAL resolutions of 288p and 576i also display on this card, both read as 576i, and I guess technically the alternating video modes tests works. Using a test pattern meant for latency testing in the 240p test suite, I also checked the latency in a similar fashion to HDMI. Here I used a CRTV to my far left and my PC monitor on the right, and then snapped pictures and video. I also did this with my EasyCap to compare the two. With the setup, I got about 5 frames of delay, which with 60 frames a second, is about 80 milliseconds of delay. I wound up getting a similar result for my EasyCap. However, due to the delays with apps previously shown, I would probably imagine the delay is in about a 50 to 80 millisecond range. And lastly, just for the heck of it, here's some footage of my Atari 2600's coax going through my SVHS. It's read as 480i, not sure if that's how the video is sent, but hey, it works. So aside from just video quality and resolution stuff, there were some other observations I found while testing this card. For custom video timings, if you go and try to use the video timings or look at the manual, you'll find they're actually only supported on component, as well as VGA on Magewell cards that have VGA. This is a bit of a shame as custom video modes could allow one to manually set 240p input for S-Video and composite. Another thing I noticed was that the card always seemed to run hot at around 67 degrees Celsius, in comparison to my CPU running at around 38 degrees Celsius, and my GPU running at about 35 degrees Celsius. No need to fret though, I emailed support about this and they said the card running this hot at about 67 was okay. And 2 examples from Magewell's site also show high temps as well. Lastly, playing off of this capture card is something I found that overall is a good experience, but has a few quirks, and I go into them in my companion video. So I think I've done a decent job at testing this card, running through all the video inputs and using this card for several months, and I found that this card performs well, but has a few little things that aren't apparent from the get-go. I've summarized the pros and cons of this card I found without any specific comparisons to other cards in this table that you can read over yourself. The major pros I want to mention include support for 240p video for component, the support for all 3 major platforms, and the fact the card is still supported and sold. For cons, the biggest one is the lack of built-in splitting, as after throwing down money for just the card, you'll have to throw down some money for splitters as well. Additional cons include not having the DVI/VGA input that other Magewell cards have, and the breakout cable not having a distinction between the two connectors that are red and featuring a B and C connector on Composite instead of an RCA jack. And for the driver on Linux, not having to reinstall it every time you do a big update would be nice, but being part of the kernel so you don't even have to install it in the first place would be nicer, and ensure that the card is always supported even if Magewell goes under. So there are other things that I'd like to mention that could potentially fit in the pro or con category, but are a bit more subjective. Price is the biggest one, and I'll get into that later. While I did measure the delay for inputs, I have no idea how it stacks against the competition. You could say that the site's manufacturer and support being primarily Chinese is a downside as an English speaker. Being an internal card is actually something I've thought of as a downside for myself as well. For me, getting an external card would make cable management much easier. I even wound up actually having to get a different motherboard to have a free PCI slot to get the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI. Moving on, I'll go into comparisons of the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI against other capture cards I've come across in my search. For all these comparisons, assume the capture card has RCA jacks or a 3.5mm jack for audio in, and if it is component, it doesn't do 240p unless otherwise noted. First, I'll simply compare to some of Magewell's other cards. The other one that was relevant to me due to it being in my price range was Magewell's USB HDMI capture card. However, I obviously passed on it since it only has HDMI. If I really wanted an external card, I'd have to shell out quite a bit more for Magewell's all-in-one USB capture card, but it is there as an option. Interestingly enough, only the USB HDMI card has any form of pass-through or splitting. Now I'll go into much deeper detail with the Blackmagic series of capture cards, since I heavily considered getting one of their cards before settling on Magewell. They are priced more competitively with other capture cards like the Elgato and AverMedia ones, and Blackmagic themselves boast Linux support. They have two Intensity line capture cards, which at a glance seem to offer the same things in both external and internal form, and feature SPDIF input and built-in splitting. I even actually wound up getting an Intensity shuttle for Christmas last year, but sadly, I found the card doesn't have Linux support despite Blackmagic's cross-platform image. It turns out that the USB 3 version doesn't have Linux support due to issues with USB 3 in 2011, and the Thunderbolt version is unofficially supported, and I don't have an easy way to connect a Thunderbolt device anyways. From my brief experience with the card, I will say that the usage experience is not as simple as Magewell's. The internal Intensity Pro has issues of its own as well. It turns out that over HDMI and component, it can't pick up resolutions lower than 720p, making it useless for component video games. The Decklink Mini Recorder I briefly contemplated getting, but it's only a 1080 30fps HDMI card. Next, I'll show the analog-only capture cards I looked at while thinking I'd maybe get an HDMI-only card to go with it. The Hopage 1212 and 1445 are basically the same card and feature component and composite as well as built-in splitting and SPDIF input. Despite its completeness, I did decide against it, as the Decklink Mini Recorder plus Hopage 1212 combo I'd use it in would leave me without both 1080p 60 and 240p component support, and I'd rather miss only one of these. I also briefly toyed with the idea of getting an HDMI and component card, and to go with it, I could get something like an EasyCap, but I would be gambling whether I got one with a working S-Video connector or not, due to the variations of EasyCaps, like I mentioned. If I wanted to make sure S-Video worked, something slightly more expensive like the Dazzle was a nice option. Next, I'll show a few other expensive options on Linux I briefly peeked at. The AV.io HD is Epiphen's cheapest capture card and is still pretty well featured. There is even a forum post review of one of Epiphen's cards by a retro gamer where he tested it with low-res video from an Apple II GS and it worked, and I'd assume that all of Epiphen's cards have that capability. Osprey I'm not putting much effort into describing since only a few random cards of theirs have Linux support and it's some weird kernel labs driver that isn't straightforward. Moving forward, I'll dip into the comparisons of just good cards, not just pining for Linux support. The Microsoft line of capture cards is very well regarded by multi-generational console gamers like myself. and was the card line to match for me. They feature that coveted 240p over component support, and also have DVI and VGA in, as well as the other connectors that the Pro Capture HDMI has. The X Capture also features a Japanese D-Sub connector, and both have built-in splitting. However, aside from not supporting my preferred OS, the cards are also somewhat hard to get, and I have seen that somewhat recently a driver update actually removed the feature. Every rose has its thorns, I guess. Finally, I'll mention the capture cards most modern PC gamers think of. Here I've shown the two that were actually options for me. While Elgato doesn't officially have Linux drivers, their cards are popular enough for people to create a reversed engineered driver. But currently, as far as I know, it is only fully featured with the Elgato Game Capture HD, and supposedly the Game Capture HD 60. The Game Capture HD is the only Elgato card with the 4 inputs I want, but it's a USB 2.0 card, so the HDMI capture is bottlenecked. For AverMedia, their HD C985 has a Linux driver, but for some reason it can only do 1080 at 30 FPS on HDMI despite being PCI. The driver is also that weird kernel lab stuff, and the page for AverMedia's cards almost imply you have to buy the driver or something. I will also quickly mention some of Elgato and AverMedia's other offerings. Elgato's other options are simple 1080p 60 FPS HDMI only capture cards. For AverMedia, their Live Gamer Extreme is their most popular card, which also happens to be the same card as the Razer Ripsaw. It has the interesting feature of having an additional audio input it mixes in. So after all these comparisons and learning what the Pro Capture HDMI offers, do I actually recommend it? Basically, if you have the same set of needs as me, then definitely yes. This is probably the best, least expensive capture card on Linux with HDMI and the 3 major analog inputs. If you want just HDMI, there are cheaper options, but they are either 1080p 30fps only, offer lower quality video, or are a Blackmagic device, so you may still want to consider this or the USB Magewell card if they're in your budget. If you're a Linux user that's only trying to use component and or SD inputs, there are cheaper options available like the Opage card shown before, as long as you don't need 240p over component. If you use Windows, I'd still recommend this card if you have the same set of needs as me in terms of inputs, and would rather have a more supported and available device rather than the Microsoft cards, which are more featured and have built-in splitting. If you want just HDMI, there are definitely cheaper options available like the Elgato HD60S. If you want all the 4 inputs like me, but don't want 240p over component, there's a much wider variety of options, and you can go with something like an HDMI only card and another card with the other 3 analog inputs, like an Elgato Game Capture HD. So this sums up my review of the Pro Capture HDMI, a good capture card choice for a wide variety of Linux users that's in between the average and too expensive range, and a good option for gamers wanting 240p over component and then some on Mac and Windows. If you do decide to purchase this capture card, or are more curious on what the usage experience is like, I also recommend checking out my companion video for the Magewell Pro Capture HDMI. If you want to see more footage from this capture card, you can check out the 240p test suite footage playlist. Otherwise, this is it. Peace out. Bye.